clay tablet, fired and buried for nearly 5,000 years, contains a list, not of myths, not of prayers, a list of kings, and above the first name, 4 words that change everything. Kingship descended from heaven. Somewhere above that first mortal ruler, a structure existed, a hierarchy of gods, each assigned a domain, each bound by a set of rules older than the cities they oversaw. That structure held for a very long time. Then it began to come apart. The ancient Mesopotamians built one of the earliest urban civilizations on record. They also built, in careful cuneiform, a model of the cosmos that mirrored what they understood about governance. Their universe was not chaos held at bay by ritual. It was a system, a hierarchy. Divine authority moved downward through ranked classes of gods, each assigned a sphere: heaven, earth, our water, and the deep spaces between them. At the top of that structure sat the Anunnaki, the great gods, the princely offspring of the sky. Anu governed the heavens. Enlil held dominion over the earth and the air between worlds. Enki commanded the Abzu, the subterranean waters beneath all things, and with it, the domain of wisdom, craft, and design. Beneath them moved the Igigi, hundreds of lesser divine beings, tasked with the labour that kept cosmic order running. This was not mythology built for comfort. The ziggurats raised across ancient Sumer, from Eridu in the south to the Anu district at Uruk, were administrative centres as much as temples. The gods held offices, they convened councils, they issued decisions that carried consequences measured in civilizations, and yet, inscribed across the same tablets that document their authority, there are records of something else entirely: exhaustion, revolt, miscalculation, and a crisis the divine hierarchy could not contain. The system that governed all things began, by its own internal logic, to produce the conditions for its own collapse. The question the tablets leave open is not whether the gods were powerful. The records confirm they were. The question is what happens when even a functioning hierarchy accumulates pressure it was never designed to hold, and what it is willing to destroy to survive. Something about the Sumerian cosmos has always been slightly uncomfortable to categorize, not because it is strange, but because it is familiar in ways it probably should not be. The earliest records from ancient Mesopotamia do not describe a universe shaped by random divine whim. They describe a universe that was organized. Responsibilities were assigned, boundaries were drawn, authority moved through defined channels, and somewhere at the top of that structure decisions were being made that reached all the way down to the foundations of human civilization. The precise nature of those decisions is recorded in clay. What the tablets show, when read carefully and in sequence, is not what most people expect to find. To understand the structure, it helps to begin not with the gods themselves, but with the geography they were said to govern. Ancient Mesopotamian cosmology divided the known universe into distinct domains, each administered by a specific deity. Anu, the eldest of the Anunnaki, held authority over the heavens, the celestial vault above all things, the source of divine legitimacy itself. His name appears at the head of nearly every major Sumerian god list, and the weight of his position is reflected in the administrative language the texts use to describe him. Not a ruler in the emotional sense, but a sovereign in the structural one. Enlil governed the space between the earth, the air, the wind that moved across the land. In practical terms, his domain covered the world that humans inhabited. Inscriptions describe him as the one who separated heaven from earth at the moment of creation, not as a poetic act, but as a functional one. He did not create by emotion, he divided by design. Enki occupied a different kind of authority. His domain was the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater ocean believed to lie beneath the land, and through it, the principles of wisdom, craft, language, and the technical knowledge required to build and maintain civilization. The Me, the divine laws that governed everything from kingship to music to the construction of cities, were said to be held in his keeping. 3 domains, 3 administrators, a universe parcelled out with a precision that reads less like theology and more like a deed of ownership. Below these 3, the structure continued downward. The Anunnaki, as a collective, numbered among the highest tier of divine authority. Beneath them moved the Igigi, a class of lesser gods whose role in the cosmic system was not governance but labour. The texts from the Atrahasis epic are specific on this point. The Igigi maintained the waterways, managed the land, and performed the physical work required to keep the world in order. There were, according to the records, 300 of them assigned to the heavens, and 600 more distributed across the earth and the underworld. This is not metaphor. The tablets enumerate them. The system was large enough to require a census. Here is what that detail means, when held carefully. The divine administration of the Sumerian cosmos was not maintained by the gods at the top. It was sustained by the labour of those at the bottom. The Anunnaki issued directives. The Igigi executed them. The arrangement was efficient by design, and as the texts make clear, deeply unstable for the same reason. The physical evidence of this administrative structure is not purely textual. At Uruk, one of the oldest and most extensively excavated cities in Mesopotamia, archaeologists have uncovered a district dedicated specifically to Anu, a raised temple precinct constructed in multiple phases, the earliest layers dating to around the 4th millennium BC. The scale of the construction is significant. The Anu ziggurat was not built to house a deity in the way a palace houses a king. It was built to mark a territory, to indicate that a specific kind of authority resided there, and that the city below operated within its jurisdiction. Similar temple foundations have been identified across the Sumerian landscape, at Eridu, at Nippur, at Ur. Each city carried its own divine administrator. Each administrator held a designated rank within the broader hierarchy. The Sumerian king list confirms this architecture of authority. Before kingship descended to specific cities, it moved between them as if divine favour itself was a resource being reallocated from one administrative centre to the next. The cities were not random. The hierarchy was not informal. Someone, at some point, drew the lines. What the archaeological record cannot fully explain is how the system was maintained from within. The tablets suggest that the Anunnaki convened, that there was a council, a deliberative body, where decisions affecting both the divine and human worlds were reached collectively. The language used in these council scenes is the language of governance, debate, disagreement, resolution. Enlil presides, Enki advises, Anu ratifies. The structure had checks, but the checks were built into the same hierarchy they were meant to regulate. In any sufficiently layered system, the most dangerous pressures are not the ones that arrive from outside. They are the ones that accumulate quietly within, in the space between what a structure was designed to handle and what it is actually being asked to bear. The Sumerian cosmos, by its own records, was a system of extraordinary precision. Every domain assigned, every function delegated, every tier of authority documented and inscribed, and somewhere inside that precision, distributed across 300 labouring gods and a growing world below them, a pressure was already building that the tablets had not yet named. Whether a hierarchy constructed with that much care could absorb what was coming, that question, the texts suggest, had already been answered. The records just had not reached that part of the story yet. The first crisis in the Sumerian cosmos did not begin with a war. It began with exhaustion. That detail is easy to pass over, and most accounts do. The focus tends to fall on the creation of humanity as a theological event, a moment of divine generosity or cosmic design. But the tablets that record it tell a different story, one that starts not with a gift, but with a complaint. And the complaint came not from below, but from within the divine structure itself. Something had gone wrong inside the hierarchy before humans existed at all. The Atrahasis epic is among the oldest narrative texts ever recovered. Inscribed in Akkadian cuneiform and dated to approximately the 17th century BC, it preserves a tradition that is considerably older, one that reaches back into the earliest layers of Sumerian theological thought. And what it describes in its opening passages is not creation in the sense most people understand it. It describes labour conditions. The Igigi, the lower tier of the divine hierarchy, had been assigned the work of maintaining the physical world, digging the great river channels, managing the waterways, cultivating the land that sustained cosmic order. The tablets are specific about the duration. They had performed this work for what the text measures in divine years, a span the narrative treats as immense even by the standards of gods. The Tigris and Euphrates, according to the Atrahasis account, were not natural features. They were excavated by divine labour. Over an expanse of time the text does not minimize. At some point that labour reached a limit the system had not accounted for. The Igigi set down their tools. The tablets describe the moment in careful terms, not as chaos, but as a coordinated cessation. The lower gods gathered. They burned their equipment. They marched on Enlil's dwelling at night and surrounded it. The language of the text is structured and deliberate. This was not a riot. It was, by every measure the narrative applies to it, an organised act of refusal. Enlil's response is recorded as distress. He contacts Anu. Anu descends to assess the situation. The council convenes, the same deliberative body described in the administrative records, and the question placed before it is not how to punish the Igigi, but how to resolve the problem that produced the revolt. Or that distinction is significant. The divine hierarchy did not respond to the crisis with force. It responded with a policy question, and the question, once asked, had only one answer that the council found acceptable. The solution came from Enki. His proposal, preserved in the Atrahasis text, was precise. Create a new class of being to absorb the labour the Igigi could no longer sustain. This being would be formed from clay, the most common material in the Mesopotamian world, animated by something taken from a sacrificed god, and designed to function within the existing cosmic system as a working, managed population. The word used in the original text for this creation carries a meaning that translates roughly as substitute or replacement worker. Humanity in the Atrahasis account was not created in an act of love. It was created as a solution to an administrative failure. Enlil approved the proposal. The creation proceeded. Here is where the archaeological record introduces something the text alone cannot carry. The earliest evidence of large-scale irrigation infrastructure in Mesopotamia, the canal systems, the managed water channels, the deliberately shaped agricultural landscapes, dates to the 6th and 5th millennia BC, centered in the alluvial plains of southern Iraq. These are not small-scale works. The engineering required to redirect and maintain river systems across that terrain represents organized, sustained human labor on a significant scale. What the record shows is that this infrastructure did not develop gradually from scattered individual effort. It appears in the archaeological layers as a coordinated enterprise, one that presupposes not just technical knowledge, but a system for organizing and directing large numbers of people across shared tasks. The Atrahasis epic says humans were created specifically to perform the work the Igigi had abandoned. The ground beneath ancient Mesopotamia contains the physical record of exactly that kind of work, executed at exactly the scale the text implies, beginning at a period that aligns with the earliest phases of Sumerian urban development. The tablets said it happened. The landscape confirmed something did. Humanity's initial role, as the texts frame it, was bounded and functional. Populations were manageable. The work was being done. The divine hierarchy had absorbed a serious internal failure and produced a workable resolution. From the perspective of the council, the crisis had been contained. But the Atrahasis epic does not end there, and the reason it does not end there is embedded in the nature of the solution itself. A population created to perform labour does not remain static. It grows, it organises, it develops capacity beyond the original specification. The texts do not treat this as a surprise. they treat it as a consequence, one the council had not fully modelled when the decision was made. The hierarchy had solved the problem of divine exhaustion by introducing something into the system that operated by different rules than anything the system had previously contained. What the tablets record next is not the fulfillment of that solution. It is the beginning of a new and far more complicated pressure, one that would prove considerably harder to resolve than a labour strike among gods. And whether the beings created to serve would remain within the limits of their design was, by the logic of the records, never really a question the council had answered. It was only a question they had delayed. There is a word in the Atrahasis epic that translators have rendered in various ways, as noise, as clamour, as uproar. It appears in the text as the reason Enlil could no longer sleep, and the source of that noise was not a war, not a catastrophe, not a breach in the cosmic order. It was humanity, simply existing, in growing numbers. That framing has been treated in many readings as poetic metaphor, but the tablets do not use it that way. They use it as a description of a specific problem that required a specific response. Which means the question worth sitting with is not what the word means, but why a population of created labourers had grown loud enough to disturb the god who governed the earth itself. The archaeological record of ancient Mesopotamia does not deal in metaphor, it deals in layers. Excavations at Uruk, the city that gives its name to one of the most significant periods in early human history, reveal a settlement that expanded with a speed the surrounding landscape was not naturally configured to support. By the late 4th millennium BC, Uruk had become the largest urban centre in the known world, covering an area estimated at several hundred hectares and sustaining a population that required organised food production, managed water distribution, and a functioning administrative apparatus simply to persist from one season to the next. This was not gradual. The archaeological layers show a rate of growth that compressed what might be expected to take many generations into a comparatively narrow window of time. Temples were rebuilt on top of temples. Districts expanded outward from existing cores. The city did not grow the way organic settlements tend to grow, incrementally, randomly, in response to local conditions. It grew as if driven by a force the landscape itself had not generated. At Eridu, the oldest city in Sumerian tradition, the temple sequence tells a similar story. 17 layers of construction have been identified at the site, each built directly over the last, each representing not just renovation, but deliberate continuation, a sustained investment in a specific place across a span of time that reaches back to the 6th millennium BC. Something kept drawing people back to that location, generation after generation, in numbers large enough to require permanent, expanding infrastructure. The ground does not explain why, it only confirms that it happened. What the cuneiform tablets add to that picture is the texture of what urban complexity actually looked like from the inside. Administrative records recovered from Uruk and other early Sumerian cities include some of the oldest written documents ever found. Not religious texts, not royal proclamations, but inventories, grain tallies, labour allocations, records of irrigation maintenance, livestock distribution, and the management of temple resources across populations too large to govern by memory alone. Writing, in its earliest recoverable form, was invented to track the scale of human activity. That scale had become too large for any other method to contain. The same tablets that record grain distributions also record a civilization developing specializations the original labour model had not anticipated. Metallurgy, long-distance trade networks reaching into Anatolia and the Iranian plateau, craft production at a volume that implies organised workshops rather than household industry. The humans created to dig canals and tend fields had, within the span the records cover, built economies. That development was not part of the original design. The Atrahasis text is silent on whether it was expected. Its silence on that point is, in its own way, an answer. Here is the detail the texts introduce at this point that changes the shape of everything preceding it. And the Atrahasis epic records that Enlil brought his concern before the divine council not once, but repeatedly. Each time, the framing is the same. The noise of humanity has become intolerable. Each time, the Council's response is a targeted intervention, not a conversation about whether the original creation was sound, but an attempt to reduce the pressure without dismantling the system that produced it. The interventions are recorded as plague, drought, and famine, disasters calibrated to reduce human population without eliminating it entirely. And each one, the text confirms, failed, not because humans resisted them through force, but because Enki intervened quietly, each time, to ensure that enough knowledge and resource survived to allow recovery. Enlil was attempting to solve a problem. Enki was, each time, preventing the solution from taking effect. The council was not unified. It had not been unified, the record suggests, since the moment the creation decision was made. What appeared from the outside as a functioning hierarchy was, in the administrative language the tablets themselves use, a system running two competing policies simultaneously, and generating neither resolution nor collapse, only accumulating tension. The noise the Atrahasis epic describes was never simply about population size. Read against the archaeological evidence of what Sumerian cities had become by the 3rd millennium BC, their scale, their complexity, their internal systems of governance that operated without direct divine instruction, the word carries a different weight. It describes something the hierarchy had not modelled and could not comfortably contain, a creation that had outgrown the problem it was made to solve and was now generating problems of its own. Enlil understood this. The tablets record his understanding in the language of frustration, of sleeplessness, of a governing authority watching a system drift beyond its designed parameters. What they do not record, not yet, is how far he was willing to go to bring it back. Whether frustration, sustained long enough and left without resolution inside a divided council, eventually becomes something more irreversible than policy. That was the question the hierarchy had not yet answered. The noise, by all accounts, was still growing. The most consequential conflict in the Sumerian divine record was not fought with weapons. It was conducted in council chambers, in whispered warnings, in decisions made and quietly unmade. And it had been running, the texts suggest, far longer than most readings acknowledge. What makes it unsettling is not its scale, it is its familiarity. 2 administrators, 1 system, irreconcilable conclusions about what that system was for. The division between Enlil and Enki is present in the earliest recoverable Sumerian texts, not as a dramatic rupture, but as a structural condition, something baked into the hierarchy from the moment the creation decision was made, and the longer it ran without resolution, the more the entire cosmic order bent around it. Enlil's position, as the tablets consistently frame it, was not cruelty, it was governance logic. He had been assigned authority over the earth, over the land, the air, the conditions under which civilization either functioned or failed. From that position, a growing human population was not an abstraction. It was a load-bearing variable inside a system he was responsible for maintaining. When that variable exceeded manageable parameters, the system itself was at risk. The hymn to Enlil, one of the oldest surviving compositions in the Sumerian literary tradition, describes him in terms that are almost entirely administrative, the one without whom no city is founded, no settlement built, no king installed. His authority was not personal, it was structural, and structures by their nature have tolerances. Humanity had begun to exceed his. Enki's position was different in kind, not merely in degree. Where Enlil governed by maintaining defined boundaries, Enki operated through what the texts describe as wisdom, a quality the Sumerian tradition associated not with control, but with understanding how systems actually function beneath their stated rules. Enki had designed the creation. He had specified the materials, the animating principle, the functional parameters of the human being as a working entity. He understood, better than anyone in the council, what humans were capable of becoming, and the texts suggest he did not find that prospect threatening. He found it, in the language of his associated hymns, generative. The Enki and the World Order text, recovered in fragmentary form from multiple sites, it describes him distributing the me, the divine laws governing civilization, across human domains, agriculture, animal husbandry, the crafts, the construction of cities, the administration of justice. These are not gifts bestowed reluctantly. They are assignments. Enki in this text is not protecting humans from the consequences of their growth. He is actively equipping them for it. Enlil was trying to reduce human complexity. Enki was quietly expanding it. Both were operating within the same hierarchy. Neither was violating its formal rules. The system had no mechanism for resolving the contradiction between them. Here is where the textual record introduces something that reframes the entire sequence of interventions described in the previous chapter. The plagues, droughts, and famines the Atrahasis epic records as Enlil's attempts to reduce human population were not, strictly speaking, unilateral decisions. They passed through the council. They were, by the logic of the divine administrative structure, approved policy, which means Enki's repeated interference, his quiet transmission of knowledge and resource that allowed human populations to survive each intervention, was not simply compassion. It was the deliberate subversion of council-approved decisions by a sitting member of that same council. The hierarchy that governed the cosmos was not being pressured from outside. It was being undermined from within by one of its own senior administrators, repeatedly, across what the narrative treats as an extended span of time. Enlil knew. However, the texts do not record a moment of discovery because there was none. Enki's opposition was not concealed in any deep structural sense. It was simply never formally acknowledged, because acknowledging it would have forced a resolution the council was not prepared to reach. A governing body that cannot address an open contradiction within its own membership does not resolve that contradiction. It accumulates it. The mythological record adds a further layer that the administrative texts alone do not carry. In several Sumerian and Akkadian compositions, Enki is described as warning specific humans, individuals chosen without council approval, of impending divine interventions. Not after the decisions were made, but before they were fully executed. The warnings were not general, they were targeted. They came with instructions. This pattern appears across more than one text, in more than one tradition, describing more than one event. Which means it was not an isolated act of conscience. It was a method. Enki had developed a practice of selectively preserving human knowledge and capacity across each intervention cycle, ensuring that whatever Enlil's policies reduced, enough survived to rebuild. The interventions were failing not because they were poorly designed. They were failing because the system contained a mechanism operating in parallel, specifically engineered to absorb their effects. What the texts leave unresolved, and this is the weight that accumulates across every chapter of the Atrahasis narrative, is what happens to a divided council when its internal contradiction finally becomes impossible to manage quietly. Enlil's frustration, as the tablets record it, was not with humanity alone. It was with a situation in which every tool available to him was being neutralized by a colleague he could not formally confront without fracturing the structure they both served. The divine hierarchy had survived the Agigi revolt. It had survived the creation decision. It had survived the slow expansion of human civilization into domains the original design had not specified. What it had not yet survived was the moment when incremental interventions stopped being a viable strategy, and the council was forced to consider something that could not be quietly undone. Whether the system that had bent this far could avoid breaking entirely was no longer a theoretical question. The answer was already being written. The council just had not read it yet. There are sites in the ancient Near East where the archaeological record simply stops, not gradually, not through the slow accumulation of abandonment that typically marks the end of a settlement. The occupation ends in a layer, a stratum of ash, burned material, and in some cases, structural evidence that the destruction was neither accidental nor incremental. Archaeologists have catalogued these layers. They have dated them. What they have been more cautious about is explaining in precise terms what produced them. The Sumerian texts have their own explanation. Whether that explanation is taken literally or not, it describes something the ground itself appears to confirm, that destruction, in the ancient Mesopotamian world, arrived at specific times, in specific places, with a specificity that random disaster does not easily account for. The epic literature of ancient Mesopotamia contains a category of divine instrument that scholarship has not settled on a single translation for. The terms used in Sumerian and Akkadian texts across multiple compositions describe weapons or forces associated with intense heat, with brilliance, with a quality of destructive power that the texts treat as categorically different from flood or famine. The Sumerian term most frequently cited in this context is associated with a radiant or blazing force, something the texts connect to specific divine actors and specific moments of targeted destruction. In the Lamentation texts, a genre of Sumerian literature that records the destruction of major cities including Ur, Nippur and Eridu, the language used to describe what happened to those cities is not the language of invasion or siege. It is the language of something descending, something that moved through the city and left it changed in ways that conventional military action does not produce. The lament for the destruction of Ur, one of the most extensively studied texts in this genre, describes a force that the goddess Ningal pleads with the divine council to withhold, not because it is disproportionate, but because it cannot be recalled once deployed. The council deliberates, the decision is made, and what follows, the text describes as irreversible, a weapon the gods themselves treat as a threshold, something on the far side of which there is no administrative correction, is worth examining carefully. The archaeological evidence introduces detail here that the textual record alone cannot carry. At several sites across the ancient Near East, including locations in the region of the Dead Sea Plain, investigated and documented by geologists and archaeologists in peer-reviewed publications, researchers have identified a destruction layer dating to approximately the 3rd millennium BC that contains materials inconsistent with conventional burning. The layer includes vitrified sediments, sand and soil fused into glass-like substance by temperatures that wood-fueled fires cannot generate. It contains melted building materials, charred skeletal remains positioned in ways consistent with sudden, rather than prolonged, destruction events. The temperatures required to produce vitrified sediment in an open archaeological context have been estimated at ranges that existing ancient technologies, including the most advanced metallurgical furnaces of the period, could not sustain across the surface area the destruction layers cover. The sites were occupied. Then, within what the stratigraphy indicates was a very short time frame, they were not. No subsequent settlement was built on several of them for centuries. In the ancient world, where habitable land near water was a resource communities fought to retain, that absence is its own kind of evidence. The Sumerian texts do not treat these destructions as natural events. They treat them as deployments, as the application of specific instruments by specific divine actors for reasons the council had deliberated and approved. What the council was approving by this point in the narrative the tablets construct was no longer targeted intervention. The plagues and famines of earlier chapters had been calibrated, designed to reduce without eliminating, to pressure without destroying. What the texts describe in this phase is a shift in the scale of deliberation. The council was no longer asking how to reduce human complexity. It was asking how much destruction the cosmic system could absorb before the question of total reset became unavoidable. That is a different kind of meeting, and the texts mark it as such, not through dramatic language, but through the quality of what is being weighed. The gods in these council scenes are not angry. They are deliberating. There is a precision to the discussion that is, in its own way, more unsettling than fury would be, or Enlil's position had not changed. But the options available to him had narrowed, and the options being placed before the council had escalated beyond anything the original administrative framework had been designed to authorize. Humans, across all of this, continued to survive. The cities that were destroyed were rebuilt, sometimes on the same foundations, sometimes displaced to nearby sites, but the activity continued. The administrative records do not stop. The irrigation systems were maintained, the temples were reconstructed. Whatever the interventions produced, they did not produce the reduction in complexity the Council had been seeking. There is something in that persistence that the texts do not explain and the archaeology does not resolve. A population-absorbing disaster at the scale these records describe, and continuing to function, to build, to expand, is not simply resilient in the ordinary sense. It is operating by a logic the interventions were not designed to account for. The council that had approved targeted plagues, rationed droughts, and deployed forces the texts treat with the gravity of threshold weapons was now in a position it had not formally named but could not avoid approaching. The instruments it had used had not failed because they were weak. They had failed because the system they were applied to had become, through the very labour it was created to perform, something capable of absorbing them. What comes after the failure of every calibrated option is not, in the administrative logic the Sumerian texts consistently apply, an absence of decision. It is a larger one. Whether the council was prepared to make it, and what making it would require them to become, was the question the tablets had been building toward since the first complaint was filed against a noise that would not quiet. The deliberation, the records suggest, was nearly over. The most important meeting in Sumerian cosmological history is not described as a dramatic moment. It is described as a procedural one. The council convened. The matter was placed before the assembly. A decision was reached. The texts that record it, across multiple traditions in multiple languages, preserved on tablets separated by centuries of transmission, treat the event with the same administrative register they use for any other council ruling, as though what was being decided was an ordinary question of policy. What was being decided was the end of the world as it existed. The restraint of that framing is, on reflection, more disturbing than any dramatic rendering could be. The flood narrative appears in Sumerian literature well before its most famous iteration, in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest flood accounts in the written record, preserves a Sumerian version in which the decision originates at the divine council level and a single individual is warned to survive it. The structural elements are consistent across traditions: divine assembly, collective decision, selected survivor, preserved knowledge. What the Gilgamesh version adds, recorded on the 11th tablet of the standard Babylonian text, recovered from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, is the interior of the council deliberation itself. It is in this account that the survivor, Utnapishtim, describes to Gilgamesh what was decided and how. And it is here that the most significant detail of the entire sequence is embedded, quietly, in the procedural language of the record. The gods swore an oath of secrecy, every member of the council. Before the flood was executed, each divine administrator bound themselves to silence, specifically to prevent any warning from reaching the human population. That oath is not a minor detail. An oath of secrecy only has function if there is a known risk of disclosure. The council did not swear to silence because disclosure was unimaginable. It swore to silence because one of its members had a documented history of exactly that. Enlil's argument before the council, as the texts reconstruct it, had reached its terminal form. The interventions had failed. The targeted destructions had not produced the systemic reduction the council had sought. Human populations had absorbed each measure and continued expanding, not in spite of the crises, but in ways that suggested the crises themselves had accelerated certain kinds of adaptation. Cities had been rebuilt with improved infrastructure. Trade networks had extended further after disruptions than before them. The administrative complexity Enlil had identified as the core problem had not diminished. It had deepened. His position was now this: the system could not be corrected incrementally. It required a reset at a scale that incremental tools could not achieve. The flood, a mechanism described in the texts as drawing simultaneously on subterranean waters and atmospheric forces, was not a punishment in the emotional sense. It was, in Enlil's framing, an engineering solution. The council, by the evidence of its oath, agreed. Here is the detail that reframes everything the previous chapters have established. Linguistic analysis of the flood accounts across Sumerian, Akkadian, and later traditions has identified a consistent structural feature in the way Enki's warning to Utnapishtim is recorded. In the Gilgamesh version, Enki does not speak to Utnapishtim directly. He speaks to the wall of a reed house, and instructs the wall to listen and the man behind it to act on what the wall has heard. This is not poetic decoration. It is a legal construction, and Enki had sworn the same oath as every other council member. Direct disclosure would have constituted a violation of a binding divine agreement, an act with consequences the texts treat as severe. By speaking to the wall rather than the man, Enki found the precise boundary of the oath's language and operated in the space just outside it. The warning was transmitted. The oath was, by the narrowest technical definition, not broken. A senior divine administrator, facing a council decision he considered catastrophically wrong, did not defy the system openly. He found the exact linguistic threshold of his constraint and worked within it, while ensuring the outcome he intended was achieved regardless. This is not the behaviour of a god acting on impulse. It is the behaviour of someone who had been planning for this moment across the full span of interventions that preceded it. What Enki preserved was not simply a man and a vessel. The texts, across their various versions, describe the instruction given to Utnapishtim in terms that extend well beyond personal survival. He was told to bring aboard representatives of living things, a detail the narrative shares with flood traditions that appear independently across Mesopotamian, Indian, and other ancient literatures. But he was also, in the Atrahasis version of the account, the carrier of something less tangible, the knowledge required to rebuild not just population, but civilization. The me, the divine laws of craft, governance, agriculture, and social organization that Enki had distributed across human domains, were not stored in temples that would survive a flood. They were stored in practice, in transmission, in the accumulated technical knowledge of people who knew how to do specific things. Enki did not just preserve a survivor, he preserved a repository. Whatever the flood was designed to erase, the information required to reconstruct it was already aboard before the waters rose. The council had made its decision through legitimate process. The oath had been sworn by every member. The mechanism had been approved. And somewhere, moving quietly through the administrative margins of a binding divine agreement, the god who had designed humanity in the first place was ensuring that the decision the council had reached would not achieve what the council believed it would. The flood had been authorized. Its outcome had already been partially determined by someone who never voted against it. How those two facts would resolve, what world would emerge from the collision between a council-sanctioned destruction and one administrator's careful preservation, was no longer a matter of deliberation. The waters were the next question, and they were already coming. Beneath the ancient city of Ur, archaeologists digging in the early 20th century encountered something that stopped the excavation. A layer of clean, water-deposited silt, nearly 3 meters thick in places, sitting between two distinct periods of human occupation. Below it, one civilization. Above it, another. And between them, nothing. No artifacts, no structures, no evidence of continuous habitation across the gap. Leonard Woolley, who led the excavation, looked at what his team had uncovered and said simply, "This is the flood. Not a flood. The flood." Whether or not that identification was precise, the layer itself is real, documented, and has never been fully explained by the ordinary patterns of Mesopotamian river behavior. The ground remembered something. The question is how much? The Gilgamesh account of the flood's mechanics is specific in ways that casual readings tend to overlook. The waters did not come from rain alone. The text describes a dual mechanism, the Abzu, a subterranean freshwater reservoir that Enki governed, releasing its contents upward through the foundations of the earth, simultaneously with a storm system descending from above. The flood in this account was not a weather event. It was a convergence of forces operating from two directions at once, compressing the inhabited world between them. The Atrahasis version uses similar language. The great water channels, the very infrastructure the Igigi had excavated and humans had maintained across centuries, are described as overwhelmed from below before the rain arrived from above. The rivers did not overflow. They were, in the framing of the text, deliberately engaged as part of the mechanism. The Tigris and Euphrates, which had been excavated to sustain civilization, became, in this reading, instruments of its undoing. Geological surveys of the Mesopotamian alluvial plain have identified evidence of catastrophic inundation events in the region, dating to approximately 2900 BC, a date that sits within the period the Sumerian king list treats as the boundary between the antediluvian and post-flood eras. Core samples taken from the sediment layers of the lower Mesopotamian plain show deposits consistent with rapid, large-scale water movement across terrain that was, at the time, densely occupied. The flood layer identified at Ur is not unique. Similar strata have been documented at Kish, at Shuruppak, the city the Atrahasis epic identifies as the home of its flood survivor, and at other sites distributed across the southern plain. They do not all date to precisely the same moment, but they cluster, and their clustering around a period the Sumerian texts independently mark as a civilizational threshold is a coincidence the archaeological literature has not resolved. What the layers cannot determine is whether what they record was a single event or the accumulated memory of several compressed by tradition into one. The texts do not make that distinction. They record one flood, one decision, one survivor, and they treat what came before it and what came after it as categorically different ages. Utnapishtim's vessel, as described in the Gilgamesh account, was not a boat in the ordinary sense. The dimensions recorded in the text, a structure of equal length, width, and height, divided into internal compartments across multiple levels, describe something closer to an enclosed cube than a navigational craft, and as scholars have noted that the proportions specified would produce a vessel of extreme stability in flood conditions, but minimal directional control. It was not designed to go anywhere. It was designed to survive. What it carried, the text enumerates carefully. Family members, craftspeople, representatives of living species, and the preserved seeds of vegetation. The Atrahasis version extends this list to include, in language that requires some interpretive care, the knowledge and skills associated with the technical foundations of civilization. The vessel was a container for continuity. Its cargo was not simply biological, it was informational. Here's what the Sumerian king list records at this precise juncture, and why it matters more than it is usually given credit for. The antediluvian section of the king list, the portion covering the reigns before the flood, records 8 kings across 5 cities, with reign lengths measured in thousands of years. The longest reign listed is 43,200 years. The shortest is 18,600 years. These figures have been treated by modern scholarship as mythological, as numerical symbolism, as evidence of a cosmological rather than historical framework. Then the flood comes, and after it, the reign lengths collapse. The first king listed after the flood rules for 1,560 years. His successor rules for 1,200 years. Within a few more generations, the reigns are measured in hundreds, then in decades. The numbers descend across the post-flood king list toward figures that begin to resemble human lifespans. The text does not explain this compression. It does not comment on it. It simply records it. as if the reduction in the scale of human existence after the flood was a known and unremarkable consequence of what had occurred. Something changed. The record notes it without elaborating. When the waters receded, the world the council had administered no longer existed in the form it had governed. The cities of the antediluvian period, Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, were either destroyed, buried, or so drastically reduced that the post-flood record treats the reinstatement of kingship as a new beginning rather than a continuation. The Sumerian king list does not resume after the flood, it restarts. Kingship descended from heaven again, to different cities, through different lines. Under conditions the pre-flood administrative structure had not specified and could not have anticipated, because the structure that would have specified them no longer existed. The council had authorized a reset. What it had not fully modelled was that a reset applies to everything, including the authority of those who ordered it. What rules would now govern a world the old hierarchy had destroyed and a single administrator's foresight had partially preserved? That was not a question the flood had answered. It was the question the flood had made unavoidable. The first thing the survivors did, according to the texts, was not rebuild. It was offer sacrifice. That detail has been read as piety, as gratitude for survival, as an instinctive turn toward the divine in the aftermath of catastrophe. But the Gilgamesh account frames it differently. When Utnapishtim disembarks and burns offerings on the mountain, the gods are described as gathering around the smoke like those who have not eaten in a long time. The language is precise and, on reflection, unsettling. The beings who had just authorized the destruction of the civilization that sustained them were now drawn to the evidence of its survival. The gods needed what they had tried to destroy. That tension, present in the very first moment of the post-flood world, runs through everything the rebuilt civilization would become. The Sumerian king list records the post-flood reinstatement of kingship with a single or unadorned statement: after the flood had swept over the earth, kingship descended from heaven again. The first city to receive it was Kish. Kish does not appear in the antediluvian portion of the list. It was not among the 5 pre-flood cities the text names as centres of divine administration. Its selection as the first seat of post-flood kingship was not, therefore, a restoration of the previous order. It was the establishment of a new one, in a new location, under new conditions, with new lines of authority connecting the human and divine worlds. Archaeological excavations at Kish have confirmed occupation layers dating to the early dynastic period, consistent with the post-flood chronology the king list implies. The site shows evidence of rapid urban development, administrative buildings, temple structures, and the physical infrastructure of a functioning city-state appearing within a relatively compressed archaeological window. Something was being built quickly, deliberately, and according to a plan that the builders had not developed from scratch. The knowledge that Enki had ensured survived the flood was already at work. The city that rose first after the waters receded was not improvised. It was reconstructed. The administrative structure of post-flood Mesopotamian cities carries a signature that distinguishes it, in specific ways, from what the antediluvian record describes. In the pre-flood texts, divine authority operates directly. The gods intervene, instruct, and administer through mechanisms the texts treat as immediate and personal, Enki warns. Enlil decides. The council convenes and its decisions produce tangible effects in the physical world within the narrative time frame the stories describe. In the post-flood record, that directness recedes. The temples built after the flood are larger, more elaborate, and more institutionally complex than their predecessors. The ziggurat form, a stepped platform raising the temple precinct above the surrounding city, becomes the dominant architectural expression of divine authority across the Mesopotamian landscape. These structures were not simply places of worship, they were administrative centres, economic hubs, and repositories of the technical and legal knowledge required to govern a city-state. What they represent structurally is the institutionalization of a relationship that had previously been direct. Well, the gods had not disappeared from Mesopotamian civilization after the flood. They had been architecturally relocated, placed at a formal remove, mediated through priesthoods, ritual calendars, and the increasingly complex bureaucratic apparatus of the temple economy. The divine hierarchy was still present. It was simply no longer operating in the same register. Here is the detail embedded in the post-flood king list that has not received the attention it warrants. The reign lengths after the flood do not simply shorten, they shorten in a pattern. The first post-flood kings rule for spans still measured in the thousands of years. Jusha of Kish for 1,560 years, his successor Kulasina Bel for 1,200 years. Then the compression accelerates, within 10 generations. Reigns are measured in hundreds, within 20, in decades. The curve does not flatten, it continues descending toward the biological range of ordinary human lifespans. The Atrahasis epic and the Gilgamesh account both contain passages describing a deliberate divine decision made in the aftermath of the flood to impose a natural lifespan on humanity. The antediluvian figures, both the kings in the list and the pre-flood humans described in the mythological texts, existed in a different biological framework. The flood did not simply reduce population. According to the texts, it marked the point at which the conditions of human existence were formally revised. Shorter lives, less direct divine contact, and greater individual and collective responsibility for maintaining civilization without the operational involvement of the gods who had designed it. The post-flood world was not a restoration. It was a renegotiation, and humanity had not been present for the terms. The city of Akkad, which would eventually give its name to the first true empire in recorded history under Sargon, in the 24th century BC, does not appear in the early post-flood record as a major centre. Its rise belongs to a later phase of Mesopotamian development. But the administrative traditions that made the Akkadian Empire possible were already present in the post-flood urban landscape from which it emerged. Cuneiform administrative records from the early dynastic period, covering the centuries immediately following the flood chronology, show city-states operating with a level of institutional sophistication that presupposes not just technical knowledge, but a shared framework of governance. Legal codes, property records, temple accounts, diplomatic correspondence between cities that recognized each other's administrative legitimacy. This framework did not develop spontaneously from scattered survivors. It spread through trade networks, through shared religious traditions, through the transmission of a common body of technical and legal knowledge across the settlements that rose after the flood receded. The me that Enki had distributed and preserved were not abstract, they were operational, and they were already running. What the post-flood texts preserve, underneath their accounts of rebuilding and reorganization, is something more difficult to categorize, a record of adjustment, of a civilization learning to function within constraints it had not chosen and could not renegotiate. The gods were still there, present in the temples, invoked in the king lists, credited with the authority that gave human rulers their legitimacy. But the quality of their presence had changed. The Sumerian lamentation texts, composed during periods of political collapse in the centuries after the flood era, describe divine abandonment as the primary explanation for disaster, a god withdrawing from a city, leaving it unprotected, allowing its destruction. The fear encoded in those laments is not the fear of divine anger, it is the fear of divine absence, of a civilization that had been rebuilt on the assumption of continued divine oversight, confronting the possibility that the oversight had become intermittent. The sacrifice Utnapishtim offered on the mountain had drawn the gods close. The question the post-flood world could not answer, and the one the lamentation texts suggest it never stopped asking, was how long that proximity would hold. The hierarchy had survived the flood in altered form. Humanity had survived it in reduced form. What the two would make of each other, in a world neither had fully designed, was a question the tablets recorded in the spaces between their administrative entries, in the prayers appended to legal documents, in the divine names inscribed above city gates, in the ritual calendars that structured every year around the management of a relationship that the flood had permanently changed. Whether that relationship had been repaired or simply resumed under new terms neither side had fully accepted was not a question the rebuilding itself could answer. It was a question the next age would have to live inside. Somewhere in the ruins of Nineveh, in a room that had not been opened for more than 2,000 years, archaeologists in the 19th century found a library, not a metaphorical library, a physical one, tens of thousands of clay tablets, systematically organized, covering history, astronomy, medicine, law, mythology, and administrative records spanning centuries of Mesopotamian civilization. It had been assembled on the orders of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal in the 7th century BC, who sent scribes across the known world to copy texts from older collections before those collections were lost. Ashurbanipal was not a scholar in the modern sense. He was a king who believed explicitly and on the record that the knowledge contained in those tablets was not merely historical, it was operational. It described how the world actually functioned, including the relationship between human civilization and the divine forces that had shaped it. He was preserving something he considered still relevant. That judgment, made in the 7th century BC, is itself a piece of evidence worth holding carefully. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic recovered largely from Ashurbanipal's library, represents the most significant reorganization of the Sumerian divine hierarchy in the textual record. Composed in its canonical form during the early 1st millennium BC, it retells the story of cosmic order not as a function of the Anunnaki Council, but as the consequence of a single god's supremacy. Marduk, the patron deity of Babylon, defeats the primordial force of chaos, constructs the world from the resulting material, and is awarded the 50 names of divine authority, absorbing in the logic of the text the functions previously distributed across the senior Anunnaki, Anu's celestial authority, Enlil's dominion over the earth, Enki's command of wisdom and craft, all consolidated into one administrative figure serving one city, legitimizing one political order. This was not a theological development in isolation. It accompanied, and in many ways justified, Babylon's emergence as the dominant political center of Mesopotamia. The redistribution of divine authority in the Enuma Elish mapped precisely onto the redistribution of human political authority that Babylonian imperial expansion was producing in the physical world. The War of the Gods, in its final literary iteration, had become an argument for centralization. The council that had governed by collective deliberation, the same council whose internal divisions had produced the flood, had been replaced in the mythological record by a single sovereign. Whether that replacement resolved the tensions the council had failed to manage, or simply relocated them, is a question the subsequent history of Babylon answers without fully stating. The knowledge preservation that Enki had engineered before the flood did not survive intact across the millennia that followed it. This is one of the most consistently overlooked implications in the long aftermath of what the Sumerian texts describe. The library of Ashurbanipal existed precisely because knowledge had been fragmenting. Scribal traditions that had once been continuous were breaking. Texts that existed in multiple copies in the 3rd millennium BC were, by the 1st millennium, known only in single exemplars, or not known at all, their existence detectable only through references in other texts that quoted from them without reproducing them. The cuneiform tradition itself was in decline. By the 1st century BC, the number of people who could read the script had contracted to a small priestly class concentrated in a handful of temple complexes. Within 2 more centuries it had effectively ended. The last known dated cuneiform tablet was inscribed in 75 AD. After that, the entire textual tradition of ancient Mesopotamia, the administrative records, the literary compositions, the astronomical observations, the legal codes, fell silent. It was not destroyed. It was simply no longer being read. The knowledge Enki had gone to such lengths to preserve had, across the span of recorded history, become inaccessible to the civilization it was meant to sustain. Here is the detail that carries the weight of the entire sequence. The flood narrative, the specific story of a divine council deciding to destroy civilization, a single survivor warned in secret, a vessel constructed to preserve living things and essential knowledge, and a world rebuilt under new terms, does not appear only in Mesopotamian sources. A structurally identical narrative appears in the Satapatha Brahmana and the Mahabharata of the Indian subcontinent, where a figure named Manu is warned by a divine being, builds a vessel, survives a catastrophic flood, and becomes the ancestor of the reconstituted human race. The warning mechanism, the vessel, the survivor, the post-flood covenant, all present. In the traditions of the Ogaigs flood preserved in Greek sources, a catastrophic inundation precedes a new age of human civilization. In Mesoamerican accounts, the Popol Vuh of the Maya specifically, a divine council creates humanity, finds the creation unsatisfactory, and destroys it with a flood before attempting a revised version. The council structure, the failed creation, the flood as reset, all present in a tradition with no known historical connection to Mesopotamia. These are not the same story copied across cultures. The details diverge in ways that rule out simple transmission. They are independent traditions that converged on the same structural elements: divine decision, catastrophic flood, selected survivor, preserved knowledge, reconstituted civilization, without any identified common source. The question that convergence raises is not one comparative mythology has fully answered. When independent traditions, separated by oceans and millennia, record the same sequence of events in the same structural order, the explanation that those traditions are purely fictional becomes harder to maintain without remainder. What they are recording, whether memory, archetype, or something that resists both categories, is still, in the most precise academic sense, an open question. The long-term consequences of the divine conflict on Sumerian culture are visible not in the dramatic moments the texts foreground, but in the texture of what daily religious life in ancient Mesopotamia actually looked like. Temple ritual in the post-flood period was not devotional in the way the word is commonly understood. It was operational. Temples maintained herds, managed agricultural land, issued loans, and administered the distribution of resources across urban populations. The priests who performed the rituals were also the accountants, the archivists, here and in many cases the astronomers, tracking celestial cycles to determine planting schedules, flood predictions, and the calendrical timing of festivals that the entire civic economy was organized around. The gods were not being worshipped in these institutions, they were being managed. The relationship that the flood had restructured, divine authority mediated through institutional distance, had produced a civilization in which the maintenance of that relationship was itself the primary organizational principle. Every major Mesopotamian city was, at its administrative core, a system for managing the terms of a post-flood covenant that no living person had negotiated and no surviving text fully explained. The ritual was the memory. Even when the meaning had faded, the structure persisted, because the structure was the only remaining record of why it had been necessary in the first place. The clay tablet that opened this story, the Sumerian king list, with its 4-word declaration that kingship descended from heaven, sits now in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. It has been there since the early 20th century. It is studied, cited, and photographed. Its contents are well documented in the academic literature. What it describes, if taken on the terms its authors applied to it, is the record of a system that was designed, that failed, that destroyed much of what it had built, and that continued in altered, diminished, institutionally mediated form. For another 3,000 years after the event it identified as the boundary between one age and another. The Anunnaki do not appear in that continued history as active administrators. They appear as foundations, as the named sources of an authority that human institutions claimed to transmit but could no longer directly access. The council that had once deliberated in real time had become, by the first millennium BC, a theological inheritance, present in name, absent in function. And yet the cities kept building temples to them. The scribes kept copying their stories. The kings kept grounding their legitimacy in lineages that traced back, through the post-flood king list, to a moment when the divine and human worlds had operated in direct contact. The memory of what the system had been was, apparently, more durable than the system itself. Whether any civilization that encodes the story of its own near destruction into the foundations of its religious, legal and political identity ever fully escapes what that story implies. Whether the lesson of a world reset by its own administrators ever stops being relevant to the worlds that came after it, is not a question the tablets answer. It is the question the tablets were written to keep asking.